Hi, I'm Peter Kamel. I'm a neuroradiologist at the University of Maryland. I serve as the clinical director for the University of Maryland Medical Intelligent Imaging Center with my colleagues Vishwa Parak and Paul Yee, and Florence Du, who you heard from this morning, who will hopefully be joining us shortly. And it's my pleasure today to talk to you about convolutional neural networks as part of the Fundamentals of Artificial Intelligence course. I have no relevant disclosures. So you may finish a course like this, and you're excited about artificial intelligence and machine learning and neural networks. And so you'll pull up one of the most cited papers on artificial intelligence, maybe something relevant to your field, and you'll see a diagram that looks like this. And you'll scratch your head, and it looks kind of confusing, and there's a lot of arrows and a lot of words that don't really make much sense. And you'll start looking at the paper, and inside the paper, there is a lot of math symbols and summations and equations, and it's all kind of confusing and all kind of doesn't make any sense. Hopefully by the end of the course today, I have a little bit of sense in what these diagrams mean. Not saying that we're going to fully understand all the math behind the convolutional neural networks, but just enough that we can get a sense of what these diagrams mean, what they're doing, what the general premise is behind these convolutional neural networks. This diagram here is for something called a UNet, which is a type of network architecture used for medical imaging segmentation that's very, very popular for image segmentation. And by the end of the talk today, hopefully you'll get a sense of what this is doing and what all these arrows and diagrams mean. So here's our outline for today. We're going to start off by talking about what exactly is a convolutional neural network. What does this word convolution actually mean? We'll be taking a look at the building blocks that form a convolutional neural network. And we'll be taking a deep dive into that on a network that you just saw, the UNet for medical imaging segmentation. And finally concluding with what information is most important for me to know. There's a lot of math and a lot of stuff underlying all the convolutional neural networks, but what is most useful for me? And maybe I'm going into residency or doing a career in radiology that plans to use AI, but not necessarily doing all the math behind convolutional neural networks. Okay, so before we get into the meat of things, it's a good to get a sense of where we are in the grand scheme of things. So you may have seen diagrams like this before, where artificial intelligence is a fairly generic term. It's a general term. Anytime we're describing how a computer behaves or demonstrates some sort of human-like intelligence. And that can be a very general term, and it's somewhat poorly defined. But when we talk about machine learning, we're referring to having a computer take in large amounts of data and be able to learn patterns and trends from the data on its own and be able to spit out an output. And what we're going to be talking about today is a neural network, which is a type of architecture for this machine learning, for performing machine learning. And specifically what we're going to be talking about is convolutional neural network, which is a specific type of neural network. And convolutional neural networks you'll hear them a lot in radiology because they perform very well for image recognition, image classification tasks. And that forms a large portion of radiology, which is why you hear about them a lot. And that's going to be a little bit different from different model architectures in machine learning, like the language models and ChatGPT and things. But the one that we're talking about today is this architecture that is best for medical imaging purposes. All right, so what exactly is a convolutional neural network? And we need to understand what exactly a convolution is. And I apologize, there's a little bit of math behind this, but I'll try to explain things on higher level things. And there'll be some diagrams that explain things that's helpful just to get a general sense of what exactly is going on. So just like addition, multiplication, and subtraction are all mathematical operations, a convolution is a description of a mathematical operation, okay? And this is a mathematical operation that can be performed between two sets of numbers, two matrices, two functions. And on a higher level thing, it's the amount of overlap two functions have when they pass through one another. We'll take a look at a diagram on the next slide that'll explain that a little bit better. But essentially what it's doing, it's telling us, it's blending two functions together and showing us how much overlap they have with one another. Okay, so let's take a look at this diagram here. And all these diagrams, you'll see the citations there if you ever like to go and review them on your own. So here we have two functions. We have one function in red, which is function f. And we have one function in blue, which is function g here. And as we pass g through f, you see this blue area, which is the overlap. And when it's mapped out as a green line, this is the function that it generates here. So this green here is the convolution of F and G. And you'll notice that it is somewhat of the blending of the two functions, okay? And mathematically, it's the amount of overlap that these two functions have as they pass through one another, okay? When we talk about imaging, and which we'll get to in a few slides, the F is going to be your image or the source data that you're performing on, the convolution on, and G is going to be what's called a kernel or a mathematical matrix that allows us to extract certain features. And by blending those two functions together, we get some output that can extract some features from the original source image, okay? But this is the fundamental from a mathematical level, what exactly a convolution is, okay? So when we talk about convolutional neural networks, it's putting together these sets of convolutional operations in a format that will allow us to extract certain features and to be able to produce an output. So this is an example of what kind of a standard convolutional neural network you'll see, where you have this input image, which is a certain way data is stored, and you have this kernel, which is going to be mathematically a matrix that is passed through over top the image, and this convolutional operation is performed, and to get certain feature maps or certain levels of the network. And you'll do this over multiple iterations, often doing another operation called pooling, which we'll talk about in a few slides as well. And you do this over time in a large network, ultimately getting many different values that you'll flatten out into what you want to get as an output, meaning a yes or no question, is there pneumonia, no pneumonia, or what exactly is this classification here? So input, kernel, producing lots of different convolutions, often doing pooling operations in a network of structures to give us a final output, which may be a classification or a distribution or something that tells us the information that we want from the image. Okay, so summarizing, a convolutional neural network is a network that takes a given input, transforms it using a network of convolutions, and returns an output often in the form of classification. And like we said earlier, this method works very, very well for image processing, and that's why we talk about it so frequently in radiology and why it's used in all the papers and that you'll see in machine learning and radiology. Okay, so let's walk through an example. And whenever you talk about convolutional neural networks, one of the very first examples that you often talk about is in digit recognition, because this was a big problem. This was a big challenge that came out that people were tackling the data. It's a very good, easy one to start off with. Because it shows you the fundamental principles of machine learning and convolutional neural networks, and the data is very clean, and there's a lot of data for it that you can play around with. So you can download this data set on your own and play around with it if you want to take a look on your own. So this right here is called the MNIST data set, which was a set of handwritten numbers of digits that had been collected over the year, and the challenge was to be able to develop an algorithm to recognize what the digits are, the handwritten digits. Okay, so the first step before you even go into your network architecture and things is how you're going to convert the image or take your input data into a numeric representation that the computer can understand. And this may be a relatively easy question for something like digits here, where the zeros are the white squares and the higher numbers up to 256 are going to be your darker squares. But when you talk about medical images and you talk about 3D MRI sequences and post-contrast and pre-contrast, and you have information related to demographics and gender, the way you input the data may also be a challenge. So here, on a simpler scale of things, here it's just an image, and we're representing them as grayscale values as matrix of numbers. Okay, and now you're going to build your architecture. You're going to build your network. Okay, and so don't be too overwhelmed. I know there's a lot of labels and things and numbers here, and let's try to break them apart and try to understand what it exactly is going on. Okay, so here we have our input image, and we see here that it's a 28 by 28, meaning we have 28 by 28 pixels, and those are the representations of the numbers, okay? And at the output, we have this output, which is labeled 10 here because we're having the 10 different digits, 0 through 9. And everything in between is going to be this network architecture that's going to be able to translate or take the data that's put in this image and give us an output of which of the numbers is this most likely to be, okay? And each step of the way we're going to have different mathematical operations. And here we're talking about the convolutional operations that we talked about earlier. Okay, and you'll often see in these diagrams that they have different different numbers or different parameters, and these are the things that people talk about in terms of optimizing hyperparameters and things, in terms of how the network trains. So here, this convolution is referring, okay, we're taking a 5x5 matrix. We're doing it 16 times, and this is a stride of one, meaning we're sliding that matrix one time, that kernel that we talked about earlier, one time each iteration as we pass the image. We'll be taking a look at some animations and things that will explain things a little bit better and clarify things in the next few slides, but bear with me as we go through this. But here we're doing a convolution. We're doing it 16 times. We're doing that 5x5 matrix, sliding it one number at a time. And ultimately, we're getting these 28 by 28 by 16, meaning that we did it 16 times, different feature maps, okay? We're going to be talking about another operation that's different from the convolution called max pooling, which is basically if we take a matrix, a 2x2 square, finding the maximum value of the numbers in that square. And you'll see that that simplifies the data. And again, in the next few slides, we'll take a look at some animations that explain that a little bit better. But we do that several times to link up these layers, these feature detectors, ultimately to give us something that leads us to the final output of whether this number is what number this digit is. Okay, and you'll oftentimes see these in code because a lot of times you'll pull up code, you may be using Keras or TensorFlow or different Python scripts, and you'll see them representing the same thing. So here, that convolutional layer, those pooling layers, those flattening layers, ultimately giving us the output level of the output that we want. Okay, so let's explain a little bit more. And here's just a very nice animation that kind of explains, in a sense, of what's going on. Okay, so here we have in the green is our input image. And this is going to refer to the data of the input, the input data of the image. And this yellow here is going to be that kernel that's sliding over the image and performing the convolutional feature on the source data. Okay, and so here we're sliding it through the image. We're sliding that yellow box through the image, and we're outputting the results of the convolution into another matrix. Okay, and so that's the mathematical operation of that source image with that with the kernel that we're doing. And so here's a diagram animation of what it's doing. So here we see that kernel again that's passing through that image, that letter A, and look at what it's doing. So here we see that it's actually highlighting in green a specific, the right side of, or certain edges of the image. So certain parts of the image are going to be green and certain parts of the image are going to be red. And what's happening here is that this convolution, this kernel, as it's passing through the input image, is be able to pick out a specific feature of the image. So here it's just a very basic thing, and it may just be the right side of the image, the right edges of the image. But as we connect these into a larger network and into a larger architecture, we can be able to get higher level things. So first we start off by detecting edges. Later on, we may be able to detect what an eye is, or what the chest wall looks like, and finally be able to detect what a pneumothorax is. But all of it, and the fundamental level, is a mathematical operation of sliding this kernel that can detect certain features or extract certain features as we pass it through the input image. Okay, so this was the convolution operation, the mathematical convolution operation. The other operation that we mentioned briefly is something called max pooling that you'll see very, very frequently in a lot of convolutional neural networks. And this is basically what happens if you slide this 2x2 square over the image and just take the maximum value as you're sliding it through. So here, this square is passing through the matrix and it's picking out the maximum value as it passes it through. This is a way of simplifying data, kind of condensing information, and we'll see some examples of that as we go into the rest of the lecture. Okay, so, well, what exactly is it doing? Well, we know there's all this math behind it, and it's all complicated, and there's a lot of different things going on here, but what is it actually doing? So, as we said, as the kernel or these filters are passed through the image, they're able to extract or highlight specific features of the image. So for example, take a look at this feature here. This is after passing one of the filters through the image. We can see here that all the right edges end up being very, very bright, and all the left edges end up being very, very dark. And then take a look at this one here. all the left edges end up being very, very bright. All the right edges end up being very, very dark. And so here at this level, it's detecting just maybe where the edge of an image is, the right side of an image here. And maybe there are other ones that look at the lower parts, or maybe ones that detect where loops are. And what happens is when we do this over multiple times, over multiple iterations, where we put all these network all together, where we're combining all these input, these filters, these convolutionals, these mask pooling layers, what we can do is we can start off by detecting features, maybe right side, left side, top, bottom, edges, things. We can be able to extract higher level features like maybe a loop is, or a circle is, or specific features are in the image. And by doing that multiple times, we can even make our way to being able to detect where the eye is or a face is in an image. And finally be able to classify the image or do more advanced things with the image. But at a fundamental level, it's just this mathematical operations that's passing through, that's being done multiple times over multiple iterations to be able to give us an output that can be able to help identify the features that we're looking at. Okay? This is a very nice website that we'll take a brief look at, published by a group that shows a lot of what's happening underneath with these convolutional neural networks as they are processing an image. So let me pull that up here and we'll take a look. And so this is an example of a convolutional neural network that's being performed on an image analysis of a car. And you can see up top here that they have the input image, and here it's going to be a 64 by 64 by 3. And the reason for that is, as we said in the first one, you have the image size. And so here it's 64 pixels by 64, but 3 here because it's going to be a red, green, blue, referring to it's a color image as opposed to a black and white image. And so they're using 3 different channels to represent the standard colors, red, green, blue. And then there's different levels to this network. So here there's a convolutional operation. This is an activation function that it just makes sure you're not getting any negative numbers. Another convolution layer. Here's that max pooling that we talked about. More convolutional layers as we finally get to our output that this image is a sports car. But let's take a look at what it's doing in each of these here. So here, for example, in the convolutional network, remember those kernels that we talked about? Here they're passing through the image and they're passing through all 3 channels, the red, green, blue. And they're doing that mathematical operation. They're doing some calculations and finally giving us the output. And they're doing that here 10 different times in the network, okay? Here they're doing this activation function, which is just making sure that the numbers are not negative. Doing another convolution here and in an intermediate step, and we can take a look at that again. Again, you're passing through those kernels, those 10 different kernels to get more features. You're extracting them, you're adding them up to get these different things. And let's take a look at this max pooling level. So this is the one where we talked about where that kernel is passing through the image and giving us the maximum value of as it's passing through the image. So here it's passing through and so here, so for example, we're passing here and it's finding the maximum value of those 2 by 2, that 2 by 2 matrix. Notice here that it's reducing the size of the image. It's simplifying things for the algorithm. Maybe it's highlighting things that are a little bit more important or more relevant to the algorithm. And those kinds of things that will be more useful for the algorithm, and it's making this determination. So it's doing this multiple times, multiple convolutions, multiple max pooling levels. And finally, being able to connect, it takes the final output, flattens all the numbers, gets all the numbers, does some mathematics, some operations there to give us a final output on what the classification of this image actually is, okay? So input image, converting the input into a specific mathematical thing, performing different operations, which are the convolutional operations, the max pooling operations, finally to give us an output of something that we're interested in identifying the thing. Okay, so let's go back to our slides here. And let's talk about a particular medical imaging application. And we'll talk about what segmentation is. So segmentation is the process of labeling a structure within the image. So for example, if I want to find all the pixels where there is tumor, that's a segmentation problem. Or if I want to highlight only where the kidney is, that's a segmentation problem. And so here's a nice example of a project we're working on here at the UMI Center, which is stroke segmentation, identifying where exactly the stroke is located or which pixels identify the stroke. And so here, the algorithm is segmenting out and identifying which parts of the image correspond to where the stroke is located, okay? And so you might be saying, you know, we were just talking about classification, where we're determining if something is a dog or a cat or a 9 or a 7. Isn't this a kind of a different problem? Well, at a fundamental level, this is a classification problem. It's just operating on a pixel level rather than a whole image. So for maybe the MNIST, the digit recognition problem, you're passing through a whole image and you're asking it to identify whether it's a 6 or a 7 or a 9. Here, it's the same thing, but it's operating on a pixel level, so that when we give the algorithm a pixel, we're asking the algorithm to tell us, is this a stroke or not a stroke? Give us a 0 for no stroke, or give us a 1 for a stroke. And it does that for all the pixels, classifies all the pixels to make a segmentation map over top the image. So segmentation fundamentally is a classification problem. All right, so let's talk about that UNet model, that diagram that we talked a lot, we looked at earlier, that we scratched our heads when we saw. And so this is called the UNet architecture. And this is a very, very popular one. Anytime you're talking about biomedical imaging segmentation, you often see these UNets described there as what they're using for their segmentation. And this is a paper that came out in 2015, so it's been almost a decade ago. But it's still very applicable, and certainly there's been a lot of improvements and modifications to it. But this is something that's been cited over 60,000 times, and you'll find that it's very, very useful for any medical application that you need for image segmentation. And let's take a look at that diagram that we started at the outset. Okay, now hopefully with some of the math, the higher level math that we learned a little bit earlier, we'll be able to understand and get a general sense of what's happening in this diagram. Okay. And so let's start off from the beginning. And so we have an input image type. Okay, easy enough. And here it looks like it's a 572 by 572, representing the pixel size, the image size. Here it looks like there's just one channel because maybe it was just a black and white image. Okay, and output here is the segmentation map. And here it's 2 channels, meaning there's going to be a 0 and a 1, referring to, you know, is this a stroke or this is not a stroke? And here the image size differs because they ended up doing some padding in the algorithm here. But at the end of result, we're getting a segmentation map that tells us where the stroke is, or where the stroke, or if the pixel corresponds to a stroke or not a stroke. Okay, and everything in between is going to be those mathematical operations that we talked about. Okay, and let's take a look here. So they have this blue arrow here. They're labeling it here con. Okay, that's that convolutional operation that we saw earlier, that we were referring to over, where you're passing through that kernel over the image to be able to detect certain features. Okay, you remember that? Here you go, is your 3x3 kernel that you're passing over the image. And you see here, they're doing it here, and it looks like they're doing it 64 times, and they're doing it again here in those network architecture there. Okay, all right, and so the multiple convolutional layers there. All right, and then let's take a look. Oh, looks like there's a red arrow here. Oh, that max pooling operation. You guys are familiar with that? You heard that when we explained it, where you're passing that 2x2 grid over the image, you're getting the maximum value and trying to simplify the image. And so here, look, the image size is shrinking because they're doing that max pooling. They're trying to simplify. Okay, and from then on, it's the same thing. They're doing convolution things. They're doing max pooling. They're doing convolution. They're doing max pooling. They're convolution, max pooling. They're ultimately shrinking the image down to a very, very small size, okay? And what this UNet architecture is doing is it has this contraction phase where it's simplifying things before it expands out and gives up the final segmentation map. And this way that this algorithm works is that you take at each level, so you're condensing the data down before expanding the data, and by copying, and you'll see that they have these connections between the levels, so that the original source data is fed in to later stages of the algorithm. On a higher level of things, what's happening here is you're training the algorithm to not only recognize what is in the image, but you're also training it to recognize where it is located in the image. And this was a very clever architecture that was designed by computer science, who are much smarter than I am, in being able to design an architecture that can be able to not only identify what's in an image, but localize something in an image. And they found that this architecture worked very, very well for medical imaging segmentation. Okay, So this is the UNet architecture. You'll see this very commonly on many segmentation problems. And at a fundamental level, it's the convolutional operations, the max pooling operations that we said. There's a contraction phase and there's an expansion phase, and that allows us to identify where something is in an image and what something is in an image. Okay, all right. So I apologize. That was a lot of math. I hope I didn't lose all of you. But what exactly do we need to know? So maybe you're a radiologist or you're a radiology resident that's interested in AI. You like the applications of AI. You think AI has a role to complement radiology in the future. So what exactly do I need to know going into my career? What's most useful for me? Well, it's certainly important to have a fundamental understanding of what's happening. You certainly don't necessarily need to know all the math or all the different operations that are happening, but it's helpful to speak the same terminology just so that you can pull up some of those papers, get a general sense of what's happening, what they're doing, and a higher level order of things. It's also very helpful to recognize the key network architectures that are used for specific purposes. So for example, that one that we were looking at there, UNet 1, that's an architecture that's very useful for segmentation. So anytime you may be wanting to find where a tumor is located in the liver, or where a stroke is located in the brain, or where the kidneys are located, that's going to be a segmentation problem, and you're going to find it's very helpful to use a UNet algorithm. I found the most useful thing is not for us to necessarily design the algorithms or design the architecture of the networks, because there are people who dedicate their whole careers, and computer scientists and PhD, that work to find what algorithms, what network architectures are best for specific use cases and specific purposes. But I think our role is to be able to recognize when to use which ones and which ones are most useful for our specific use case. And it's helpful to have partnership with computer scientists who are experts in this field. And I'm fortunate to work in the UMI Center, where we have a lot of computer scientists there who are very, very knowledgeable, and that we can take advantage of the designs they have for specific network architecture to use for our use cases in medical imaging. I think that's the most useful for us. Rather than trying to put together our own architecture or putting together all our mathematical operations or the layers and things, because there are many people who are very good at that and can do that very, very well. Okay, and so here's just the summary slide of everything that we talked about today. We talked a little bit about where we are in the grand scheme of things, that AI is the general term. We're going to machine learning neural network, and we're going convolutional neural networks, which is a specific type of neural network. And we said a convolution at a fundamental level is a mathematical operation that can be done between two matrices, two sets of numbers, two functions. And the way that it works is by blending numbers together, or blending sets of numbers together. And with that way, we can use convolution to extract specific features of an image, do that multiple times over a network of convolutions to ultimately classify an image. And we took a specific look at a network architecture called the UNet, which is one that's very commonly used for image segmentation. So that is it for my presentation. Thank you very much for your time. I hope I didn't lose many of you with all the math and the equations and things, but I think it's helpful for us to kind of get a sense of what's happening underneath it all, and at least be able to understand the language and be able to parse out some of the diagrams and get a sense of what's happening under the hood. So thank you very much, and thank you for your time.